This is a review of 20 Years of Tomb Raider, published in 2016. But before we get into the book itself, we can't not talk about this creatively bankrupt cover. It is easily in the top 5 worst covers ever shown on this channel. Think of all the infinite amazing possibilities to create a visually striking and exciting Tomb Raider cover. And yet they went with the most boring, unimaginative, just nothing eye-catching at all. Some of the most beautiful book covers are those that take the bold, minimalist approach. There's a way to do the whole simple silhouette thing, but this ain't it. I cannot fathom how an author, designer, and publishing team can look at something like this and be like, yep, no, this is a really good cover to celebrate 20 years of Tomb Raider that's going to get people excited. Ridiculous. And then as a deliciously but staggeringly ironic cherry on top, this book actually contains the following quote. "There is no more significant sales tool for a book than its cover, so with each one we are looking to capture eyes across the room." Now, in the book that's used in reference to the Tomb Raider comics, but when I read it I just had to do a gym and look into an imaginary camera. However, we've all been sufficiently warned about the perils of judging a book by its cover, and that could not be more true in this case, because beneath this bafflingly woeful cover lies an amazing-ish book. So I think the most important thing to establish first up is exactly what kind of book this is and what it covers, because this isn't just a video game book. More specifically, it is a pop culture book. The most accurate way to describe it would be that it is a reference work and the history of the Tomb Raider franchise and celebration of the pop culture icon that is Lara Croft. Some people may be a little surprised and disappointed by how relatively little space is dedicated to the games themselves. It's less than half the book. But this leads to my favorite thing about this book and what makes it so great, and that is how thorough it is. The amount of content crammed in here is incredible. So it's not just covering the history of the main games, but also includes the handheld games, board games, the movies, the animations, documentaries, the comics, the novels, the sort of more marketing stuff. It feels like it covers just about everything Tomb Raider and then some. Usually in books I prefer depth to breadth, but in this case it feels so all-encompassing in its coverage that it ends up being the great strength and appeal of the book, and makes it an incredible and illuminating history and reference work for this franchise. And of course this is only made possible through the densely packed 360 page count and the outstanding interior layout. In terms of presenting a very plain layout and design where the goal is function, this book is maybe closer to perfect than any other book I've seen. Related to that, and while we're on the subject of perfect, the imagery, the choice and variety of images, the number of images, the ratio of text to images, all absolutely chef's kissingly perfect. The only exception is occasionally some images are definitely too small, but considering how one of the most frequent complaints I make on this channel is how most books waste so much space with images that are ridiculously large, for a book like this I'm happy to accept the occasional image being too small rather than the alternative. I was delightfully surprised when I first opened the book up and saw just how text heavy it is, without sacrificing image quantity or visual appeal. And obviously the book needs all that text if it's attempting to tackle such a vast amount of content, so the book having incredible, thoughtful layout and a gigantic word count is great, but unavailing if those words are of no value. And unfortunately, this is something the book struggles with. The quality, or more specifically value, of the text is frustratingly uneven, to say the least. The book's written by Megan Marie, who is the Crystal Dynamics community manager. Half the time the text is written in a wonderfully plain and direct manner with a focus on being a brilliant history of the franchise, digging up and presenting excellent, interesting information. But this is constantly in conflict with the amount of pointless waste the book has. The book has a huge word count, but honestly as much as 50% of the text is grossly frivolous. Principally, it's that so much of the author's writing, and far worse, the quotes from the developers and others involved, feel like it's a PR piece. It feels very similar to the kind of comments you'd read in a magazine interview before the game comes out. A lot of it just feels like they're advertising their products. There's way too much focus on discussing the broad, obvious theories behind decisions and explaining the intent, rather than specific behind-the-scenes making of facts, details, or anecdotes. Too much is discussed from a bird's eye view, blanket statements that try and cover a general idea of the work done on a whole area. Of course, this is the result of trying to cover so much ground in such a small space. For that to work, it just really needed the generalizations backed up with more specific examples and details and inspirations, because that's where you get the richness and interest. This book also has plenty of that, don't get me wrong, but the amount of shallow, completely uninteresting, PR-style nothings makes up an appalling amount of the book's word count. Ditto, there's a lot of telling you about the games and features and tons of plot retellings for everything: the games, the movies, the comics, the novels. Though I do think having basic and shallow information or describing features or story is perfectly fine for some of the stuff discussed, like Game Boy or board games, the sort of things that don't need more than half a page. But for bigger projects like the main games and movies, that becomes less acceptable when you have something like 8 pages retelling the plot of the second movie with relatively few behind the scenes insights and even fewer that are actually interesting. Does seem excessive. And so I just wish the book had a better understanding that discussions of things specific and practical are better than general and theoretical. To the author's credit though, PR language aside, she's still very professional, and I was particularly grateful that she never subjects us to bloated lectures analyzing like the importance of Lara or anything like that. Even the sections that are on Lara as a pop culture icon, she keeps it relatively objective and evidence-based and leaves it to other people to say that stuff rather than inserting her own thoughts, which makes those discussions significantly less painful than they would have been in the hands of a more obnoxious author. Though that is kind of undermined by the insane overabundance of quotes from the developers, writers, artists, and fans examining and explaining Lara in repetitive and banal ways, too many of the quotes being about the opinions and thoughts of the speaker in a way that's too personal and irrelevant, and that's not what we're here for. Basically, the big problem and solution to what is dragging this book down is that the author really needs to be looking at each paragraph and quote and asking, is this of genuine interest or value to the reader? And like I said, for as much as 50%, the answer is absolutely not, which sounds awful, and it is, but it is very important to remember that that also means for the other 50%, the answer is absolutely yes. However, the ultimate manifestation of poor judgment is when the book completely shits the bed to a degree never before witnessed, and that is the preposterous amount of space given to fan works. So don't be too impressed by the large page count, because 100 of those pages, more than a quarter of this book, are taken up with cosplayers and fan art and fan films and fan design levels. I mean, there are whole page profiles on people who have written Tomb Raider fan fiction, including photos of the writers. Keep in mind, this is a book that is trying to cover so much stuff that it's disappointingly brief on the page count dedicated to the games themselves, yet has enough space to interview fan fiction writers. Now, I want to be very clear about exactly what I'm criticizing here, because I am not criticizing the works or the creators themselves. Their passion and talent are wonderful. If I saw these cosplayers' artworks, short films, or fanfiction online, or even in their own book, I would love them. What I'm criticizing here is their use in this context, their excessive and inappropriate use in a book that should be about the official works and history of Tomb Raider. As I said, this book covers so much stuff, and that's awesome, but it doesn't cover a lot of stuff as well as it potentially could, and that's understandable when trying to cover 20 years of a huge franchise, and why I was so impressed by the layout and how they packed so much in, only to find 100 pages that should have been used for that stuff is being taken up by pages and pages of quotes from random fans talking about how much they love Lara and their personal experiences, as if anyone cares. A 2-page spread full of quotes and pictures from people whose only connection to Tomb Raider is that they have Tomb Raider tattoos. I purchased this book to read about Tomb Raider itself, not its fans. Maybe, like, at most, a 10-page section on the fans would have been really nice, but over a quarter of the book, of a book like this, may be the most ridiculous, shameful, and disrespectful inclusion I've ever seen in a book. It's a complete 180 to everything I previously said about the author's professionalism when she is excessively and inexcusably letting her own interests and familiarity with things like cosplay, fan interactions, and PR communications run rampant. In fact, I struggle to believe anyone could be so ignorant as to think, no, this is really interesting and appropriate content for a book like this. This is what readers want. This is why they're they're buying this book. So it's just an insulting wank, a complete disservice to the reader and the book itself, weakening and undermining the identity of the book as being the ultimate Tomb Raider Bible. I'll be honest, I had to give up reading this section and just flip through to the end. It was too boring, irrelevant, and absolutely insufferable. And worse, really frustrating to have a book that, up to this point, and despite my disappointment with some of the text, was still what I considered a 4-star book, only to have it all of a sudden plummet to 1 star for the final 100 pages. And it sucks that the book has to end on a note like that. Speaking of ending on a sour note, though nowhere near as bad, one thing I'm very on the fence about is the inclusion of the reboot. From an objective, historical perspective, it was absolutely the right decision, because, for better or worse, the reboot is part of this franchise's history and has significant impact worthy of inclusion. However, from a literary and creative standpoint, I can't help but feel the book would have had a stronger identity had it not included the reboot, because it feels kind of strange to spend a whole book reading about how awesome and important this character is, only to get to the last 30 pages of that history and read about the creative team joyfully murdering this character and replacing her with this completely different, bland, joyless husk whose only similarity is her name. And it's like, if Lara Croft was such an amazing character that she deserved a book like this, why did they completely change her? And because this book came out before Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it feels incomplete, which runs counter to the comprehensive history that is the rest of the book. It all just feels like a weird, sad little intrusion. It's still interesting, but I feel like maybe the overall experience and identity of the book would have been stronger had it just focused on being the complete history and tribute to classic Lara. Maybe the thing I spend the most time bemoaning on this channel is how too many books waste space at the expense of including more content, and yet when I finally find this one that appears to be basically perfect on that front, only for it to have so much be inadequate content anyway. And it's an unnecessary shame that it has fan content and excessive points of lackluster text squandering the book's potential and value. Because even for something as popular as Tomb Raider, these sort of books can be very rare opportunities, so you can't afford to not make them the best possible. Who knows if or when we'll get something that has the opportunity to be better. The people involved in creating these games and such aren't going to be around forever, and this is a rare chance to capture the history and stories and insight and create a serious and meaningful historical record of things most fans don't get a chance to see and learn about otherwise. And so we have an author who has the rare privilege of actually having access to these people and all the official resources, yet refuses to make the most of it in favor of dedicating the space to worthless fluff and random unofficial creations. It just feels inexcusably squandered, and that the author should know better. And I expect better because the book shows plenty of evidence of intelligence and attention to duty, as opposed to so many other authors and books that are just completely hopeless. The parts where this book shines brightest are when Megan is being an archaeologist, digging up and preserving and presenting a lot of bigger and smaller Tomb Raider stuff. For example, an awesome 10-page section on the stories and some concept art for the cancelled games, or even just small things like a sidebar on cut content from a game or the theme park ride based on the movie. Things that might be lost to time unless you dedicate the time and effort to go searching yourself. But that's what a great reference book and researcher does, is goes out, discovers those things, and brings back the important parts and presents it all in one place. It's just that she's not very good at separating the wheat from the chaff, but the effort and passion to make the best book possible is clearly on display, which is always appreciated and worth acknowledging, and alone puts this book and its creators ahead of the vast majority of others, meaning that the areas dropping the ball in huge ways come across more like misguided ignorance rather than the apathetically lazy or negligent or completely incompetent books we usually see. But that doesn't excuse it. If anything, it only makes the disappointments that much harsher. Because this book shows so much evidence of the masterpiece it almost could have been, it's just that perhaps the awareness of how that has to manifest is lacking. The author just needs to focus less on her own interests in favor of the readers, ditch her community and communications manager press hat and just wear her historian pith helmet, take advantage of her position and focus on hunting for substance, not sound bites. If this review feels a little turbulent or conflicted with a bit of tug tug of war going on, that's because it's reflecting the nature of the book. It's hard to reconcile just how much I truly adore and appreciate the good parts and how deeply disgusted I am with the bad parts. It's a book that is so impressive, offering so many great details on so many great things, but then also what feels like an almost equal amount of poorly chosen, underwhelming text. But this is where the fact that the book has so much content crammed in becomes a real saving grace, even if a little crude, in the sense that you have this massive word count, which means you spend so much time trudging through pointless crap, but that also means there's so much great stuff too. And because so much has been packed in, it means that the net quantity of great information and enjoyment is equal to or greater than other books that may have a better ratio of good to bad text, but don't use their space as well. And so as a history and reference work, it's still phenomenal, filled with so much great information that outweighs and outshines the bad stuff. So you still get so much out of it. And again, it can't be understated how much the images really tip the balance in the book's favor. In fact, if for some reason getting more quality text was impossible, I would have been more than happy if a lot of the insubstantial text and content was cut out and that space given over to more images. In taking this book to task, well deserved as it may be, I am concerned it may have come across in a way that could potentially turn you off the book, which is not what I want at all. It may not seem like it at times, but the truth is I really do like and admire this book for its remarkable elements which outshine any dissatisfaction with its lackluster ones. That's what I want to impress upon you as the big takeaway from all this, as I think most fans will feel the same, and why I can't imagine any Tomb Raider fan from casual to hardcore who would want to be without it, even if the adoration is somewhat marred with resent at its wasteful and ridiculous parts. In fact, this book is such a must-have, I'm not even sure you can consider yourself a fan without it. As for recommended reading, there are tons of Tomb Raider related books, but I'm not going to mention any here for two reasons. First, because there is not a single one I find impressive, and second, because this book is so comprehensive, it actually includes descriptions of all the previous art and supplementary Tomb Raider books, which was very cool to see. However, one book that is an exception to both those points is The Making of Tomb Raider, which only came out last month, and so I've only been able to read a small preview on Google Books. It only deals with the first game, but it looks pretty promising, and so definitely worth looking into. Also, you may have noticed on the bottom right of each page there's a little drawing of Lara. When flicked through like a flipbook, she goes through this action sequence while also morphing between her different looks. It doesn't work perfectly because some of the pages don't have a drawing and so interrupts the sequence, which seems like a rather foolish oversight, but it is a cool little feature nonetheless.